Hey, welcome back to the Wednesday night Bible study. We are doing a study on the life of Abraham. This is our 12th installment. You'll notice I switched sides. We've moved our room around a little bit. Hopefully you'll get used to that. This installment will be called Nobody's Perfect. And if you'll recall from last time, the Lord and two angels visited Abraham at his home. And God told Abraham of his plans to check out Sodom and Gomorrah and possibly destroy it. Abraham pleaded or intercessed for Sodom, and he made his appeal on the basis that God is a just God. And Abraham and God did come to an agreement. If God could find 10 righteous people in Sodom, he would spare it. And so what happens? We read in chapter 19 that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. He did not find 10 people. It says in verse 27, early the next morning Abraham got up and returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all of the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land like smoke from a furnace. So when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham, and he brought Lot out of that's his nephew Lot, out of the catastrophe that overthrew the cities where Lot had lived. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. He didn't find 10 people. In fact, it was just Lot and his family. But for Abraham's sake, God spared Lot, and Abraham's prayers were answered in that sense. So the beginning of the next chapter, we read that Abraham and the group are moving again. It doesn't say why, but one guess is that the pasture land was ruined because of the destruction in the plains where Sodom and Gomorrah were, where they used to be. It was time to move on. So in Genesis chapter 20, now Abraham moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed in Gerar. So the next event in Abraham and Sarah's life is going to sound a little bit like deja vu, so much that I consider skipping over it. But perhaps there's something important for us to get from the story, and that is that it's a reminder to us that nobody's perfect. Not even Abraham was perfect. Think about this. Have you ever repeated a mistake? We're going to see that Abraham repeats his temptation or his mistake, being deceitful. He's going to be deceitful again. It's the very same deceit. God's grace got Abraham through the first time. Will God's grace and forgiveness get him through again? Okay, Abraham and his entourage have traveled south again to a small city in the south corner of Canaan, the city of Gerar. So what happens? And there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, she is my sister. Can you see where this is heading? Remember from several weeks back, an event back in chapter 12 of Genesis. And it's even more alike. Then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. Doesn't that sound familiar? In chapter 12 in Egypt with the Pharaoh. So Abraham claims they are brother and sister. He's deceitful, and you could say he's cowardly. And the same consequence happens. The leader takes Sarah. This is not long after Abraham spent such close time with God. So are you like me wondering what happened to Abraham's trust in the Lord? What happened to Abraham's faith in God's divine protection? When we look at that, others' mistakes seem pretty obvious, don't they? Why didn't he learn his lesson? Surely we would have, right? Except for when we don't. Are we going to find out a person only gets one chance of forgiveness with God? Let's read what God does. Genesis chapter 20, verse 3. But God came to Abimelech, the king, in a dream one night and said to him, you are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken. She is a married woman. Interesting. This king is not a believer in Abraham's God, yet he has a dream from the Hebrew God. Verse 4, now Abimelech had not gone near her. So he said, Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Did he not say to me, she is my sister? And didn't she also say, he is my brother? I have done this with a clear conscience and clean hands. You'll notice Sarah is not as innocent in this. it looks like she lied too. Then God said to him in the dream, "Yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, and so I have kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you and you will live. But if you do not return her, you may be sure that you and all yours will die." I want to point out this is the first time the word prophet is used. It's assigned to Abraham. God is giving that title to Abraham. We often think of prophets as predictors of the future, which they often are, or messengers of what God wants to tell his people, which they do. Abraham never did either of these things, nor will he in the future. But he is going to fulfill another prophetic role, which is to be an intercessor. We'll see about that in a minute. Verse 8. Early the next morning, Abimelech summoned all of his officials, and when he told them all that had happened, they were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham in and said, "What have you done to us? How have I wronged you that you have brought such great guilt upon me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that should not be done." And Abimelech asked Abraham, "What was your reason for doing this?" Sounds like a fair question. Abraham is being called out for his lie. Abraham replied, "I said to myself, there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife." Notice this isn't that God directed me. This is just, he's thinking to himself. This is his own thinking. "They will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife." Notice it was not an out and out lie. It was just a deception. They really were brother and sister. In verse 13, "And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her, 'This is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother.'" Notice that. Ever since he wandered from his father's household, it sounds like a plan was concocted way back when Abraham first left home. This was, 25 years ago. He did indeed use it to his advantage when he went to Egypt years and years earlier. It's like their fail-safe white lie or half-truth. It's a temptation that seems to trump trusting in God for Abraham. Verse 14 then Abimelech brought sheep and cattle and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham. And he returned Sarah, his wife, to him. And Abimelech said, "My land is before you. Live wherever you like." So not only did God protect Abraham and Sarah and their marriage, but all kinds of riches, including grazing rights, were bestowed on them. To Sarah, he said, the king said, I'm giving your brother, Abraham, your husband also, I'm giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This is to cover the offense against you before all who are with you. You are completely vindicated. So he tells Sarah about even more riches. More importantly, Sarah has remained pure and she is vindicated. Abraham not so much, but Sarah is vindicated. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his slave girls, so they could have children again. For the Lord had closed up every womb in Abimelech's household because of Abraham's wife, Sarah. Not only had God forgiven him and his sin of deceitfulness, but he heard and answered Abraham's prayers. No more infertility for Abimelech's household. It was the right thing to do, Abraham praying for the king and his people. But it was probably a tough prayer knowing he, Abraham, was responsible for the problem in the first place. It was Abraham's deception or lie that put the king in jeopardy. Imagine God saying to Abraham, pray for Abimelech and his people, Abraham, that they don't die as a result of what you did. That had to be a humbling and maybe guilt-inducing task to pray. Isn't it ironic the temporary affliction God put on Abimelech's people? Infertility. Why is this brought up? I mean, seems like everything in the Bible has some significance, and we may not understand everything. When God spoke to the king in his dream, him dying was brought up, but not infertility. I just wonder what was meant there by every womb being closed up because of Sarah. No scholar I ran across had any insight on that statement. The only thing I can come up with is that God wanted to protect Sarah from becoming pregnant. She became part of the king's household. Should the king not heed God's warning and sleep with Sarah, she'd be protected. So it's quite the overkill to make everyone infertile, but God can do what he wants. But the irony was that Sarah was beyond her childbearing years. You recall she even laughed when she was told she would have a child. So I'm taking this even further. Don't quote me, or you can quote me, but I don't know that this is the right answer. I'm taking this even further and saying that Abraham's prayer, which he made the household fertile again, that prayer, all of Abimelech's household, had the effect of making Sarah fertile. Take this with a grain of salt, but it's an interesting possibility. Okay, we have a couple minutes. This was a story of making mistakes and repeating mistakes and God forgiving. A story of relying on our own solutions when we should rely on God. A story of God's protection. A story of our restoration with God. Have you ever thought, I would really hate to have to do something shady, but I can and I will if I must? To that I suggest a couple things to think about. Be careful of the slippery slope. The end justifies the means. Rationalization. Or what about, you never grow too old to sin in some way? I think there's some truth there. Becoming older by age, remember Abraham was about 100 years old, or maturity, our time as Christians in our walk with God, doesn't completely destroy our sinful nature. We each have our own temptations or weaknesses. To that I say, never underestimate your temptations or weaknesses. Try not to put yourself in situations. If you're an alcoholic, it might be foolish to rent an apartment above a bar. Or if you're given to lust, you may want to limit your access to the internet. If you're addicted to food, it's not wise to eat at an all-you-can-eat buffet every day. If, in Abraham's case, this was a weakness, going to a city, doing his deceit, that might have been something that would have been best avoided. But lastly, I'd like to leave with this. Be honest about your sin. Claim God's forgiveness. And ask for strength to resist it the next time. So we're going to stop here with that story. And you all take care. Stay safe. May the Lord be with you.